all touched briefly on this, but I'm going to go ahead and ask the question anyway, hoping you'll go into a little further depth. As individual educators, do you prefer to go the strictly visual description route, or do you think that it's more appropriate to bring context and biography of artists into your descriptions of particular pieces of artwork? And in addition to that, do you offer the opportunity for, or rather, do you suggest to your patrons that they give back their own interpretations based on the information that you have provided in your descriptions?
With regard to interpretation, being a museum of contemporary art, often that's the most important thing to us. A lot of times, for example, at the Whitney Biennial, we don't actually know anything about the works of art that we're talking about because they've just been made maybe a week or two ago. So as opposed to the Met at the Guggenheim, where there's much research being done, the interpretation of the viewer is really the most important thing. So we try to encourage that as often as possible. And also with regard to biography or all of those details about the artist and the context the object was made, we do think that's very, very important because that really does make an object come alive. And we usually use the description as a launching point into a bigger conversation because that's something that can really resonate make the painting resonate. I was thinking about our current exhibition. It's actually closing tomorrow. If you haven't seen it, the Jade Theo show. One of the paintings that she made called The Rose actually took the artist 8 years to complete. And all the description in the world and all the conversations can't give the painting the weight of something that this person has really, sweat and toiled over for 8 years of life. It's just that one little bit of information turns it from an object into this labor of love, and I think that's the most important kind of bit of information about that artwork. So I thought that was a good example of why that would be so important.
The way I, as an individual educator, approach crafting a verbal description is I really think about the works that I'm choosing and the exhibition that's up. And when approaching a work of art, I really consider the work. And so sometimes, depending on the artist, depending on their story, depending on how they made the object, I consider if biography is important in the initial description. Sometimes the biography actually will be revealed later in conversation. So oftentimes we provide a very general description to get everyone kind of, in the same conversation in the same arena, and then open it up for, looking at the work further and bringing out everyone's own associations with the work and questions that they have. But it really depends for me on the artwork. We just had a show with this artist that I fell in love with, their work, Zarina Hashmi, and biography was incredibly important to every single object that she made. Jessica, you're familiar with the work. Yeah. And, so within the initial description, biography became very important to that. But there are also works of art that biography is maybe not so important or process is not so important, and that can be revealed through conversation and through questions. So in a way, I don't really have a stock style of how I craft a verbal description. I really think about what's individual about an artwork and then go from there.
I think we're probably all very much on the same page in terms of interweaving description with whatever you want to call it, contextual information, interpretation, historical information, biographical information. It depends on the work of art. It's something that we would do with any audience to some degree, but maybe in a slightly different format depending on the work and the kinds of things that we want to bring out. With a general audience or fully sighted visitors, we might start with a question about looking, which we wouldn't do with people who are blind or partially sighted, but through description and discussion with the audience, we can then weave in that information that's going to help move the conversation further and help people to develop their own interpretation, their own perspectives, just as you both have said.
I like to talk when I'm describing a work of art. I like to talk a lot about materials and my experience of the tactile quality. For example, a lot of painters will layer or use glazes, have something coming from underneath, and especially, of course, in modern art, the exploitation of the different tactile qualities of paint becomes really, really important to experiencing the work of art. And so I like, as a painter, I might have a little more to say about the materials and techniques than an art historian would, but I like to do that. I also like to ask the audience members what's in their mind after a certain moment. You know, maybe describe a little and then say, what do you imagine, and how is your experience of this? For example, I might try to describe a facial expression without imparting an emotion onto the expression, and then ask them what kind of expression they're experiencing in this portrait to have based on the description, but also sometimes actually making facial expressions themselves. Even though that sounds, to ask an audience member to frown or something might sound a little corny, but I think if everybody's doing it, it's a different level of engagement. It's like a visceral, intuitive way of engaging with the work of art, and it's so important.
I would just add, since the question was about how much context and history is added, and I think because we're coming from the point of view of a painter and an artist, Pamela and I both really seek to include that as part of the contextual information. It's not just about history or the life of the artist or why the piece was made. It's all those things, but it really is important to us to experience the artwork. Maybe as the artist experienced it, we do our best to convey that part of it.